Thank you. You may be seated. Before we actually jump into the sermon, I do want to take just a moment and say a word of thanks to the Boy Scouts for helping with the service, and also to our chancel choir and to our youth choir this morning for providing, obviously, the music. They've done such a wonderful job, haven't they? And I'm grateful to them. The other day, I had something happen that I had never before experienced. I had stopped by what used to be called Crawford Long Hospital. Now it's called Emory Midtown Hospital. And after I'd finished the business that I'd gone there to do, I was getting on an elevator to go up a few floors to cross the bridge from the hospital into the parking deck. And so when the elevator doors opened, I stepped onto the elevator and I pushed the button to go up a few floors. And the elevator doors closed, but instead of going up, the elevator started to go down. And I immediately thought, well, now that's odd, because when the elevator doors had first opened, that light outside the elevator had indicated that it was going to go up. And then I looked at the buttons inside the elevator, and the only one that was lighted up was the one that I had pushed, which was supposed to go up. Well, by that time, the elevator doors had opened, and an orderly was pushing an empty stretcher onto the elevator. And I said to him, I said, did this elevator just go down? He said, yeah. He said, I overrode the system. And then he pushed a button that was even further down than the floor we were on. And the elevator doors closed, and we started to go even further down. And I said, you mean we're going even further down? He said, yeah, afraid so. And then he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, I'm the devil and I'm taking you down. Quick as a flash, I said, well, I'm a Methodist minister and I'm going to pull you up. We all have things that can sometimes pull us down, don't we? Sometimes it can be a family situation, something related to a spouse or a parent or a child or a brother or a sister or someone else in the family. That can just pull us down. Sometimes we can have so much on our calendars that we're just pushed to do so many things, and we're physically exhausted. And physical exhaustion can sometimes affect you mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, can't it? It can just kind of pull you down. Sometimes we look at the world around us and we see so many things that are wrong with it that it just leaves us disillusioned. Or sometimes somebody can say or do something that can pull us down, can't they? Last Sunday, after the Super Bowl's dramatic finish, I couldn't help but think of that silly story of the football team that hadn't won a game all season. It was the last game of the season. They were losing by 5 points. There were 5 seconds on the clock, and they were on their own 5-yard line. And about that time, the coach happened to look down the bench, and he saw a young third-string quarterback that hadn't played a game all season, and he thought, I ought to give the boy a chance. And so he called a timeout, and he called the boy over to him, and he said, son, things look pretty bleak right now. And he said, so I'll tell you what, you just go on in there, call any play you want, and no matter how it turns out, it'll be okay. Well, the boy jogged onto the field, and he called a triple reverse play. He took the snap from the center, he handed off to one boy, who handed off to another boy, who handed off to another boy, who broke free and ran 95 yards and scored the winning touchdown just as the gun sounded. Well, the crowd went wild. They couldn't believe it. They stormed the field, they picked the young quarterback up on their shoulders, and they carried him into the locker room. After everything had settled down, the coach went over to the young quarterback and he said, son, that was a magnificent play. But how did you happen to know to call that particular play? The boy said, well, coach, when you first sent me into the game, I didn't know what to do. So he said, I just decided to look at the first jersey I saw, add the 2 numbers together, and call that play. He said, the first jersey I saw was number 75, so I added the 7 and the 5 together, and I called play number 11. Coach said, son, I hate to tell you this, but 7 and 5 doesn't equal 11, it equals 12. The boy said, gee, coach, if I was as smart as you, we would have lost that game. Sometimes things that people say or do can just pull us down, can't they? We all sometimes have experiences in our lives that can pull us down. Most of the time, I find that it's relatively routine stuff, the sort of thing that goes along with day in and day out living. But every now and then, something can come along, something that can just knock the very wind right out of you. And sometimes it can stay around for a long period of time to the point to where you feel deeply discouraged, cut off from God, cut off from other people, and cut off from the things that you love most in life. In a word, you begin to struggle with what we might call soul fatigue. This, you will remember, is exactly what the people to whom Isaiah was writing, what the people to whom Isaiah was writing were experiencing in our first lesson this morning. Years earlier, foreign invaders had come in and they had destroyed the temple. They had destroyed their national identity. They had torn the people away from their families and from their homes, and they had torn them from the land that they loved and from the faith that had meant so much to them, and they had carried them off into exile. Try to imagine for just a moment how they must have felt the hurt and the anguish and the anger, the loneliness, the hopelessness and the despair. Everything that had been near and dear to them was now gone, and this had been going on for decades. When Isaiah looked around and saw all of this and saw the looks on their faces, it broke his heart like any pastor who is worth his or her salt. Isaiah deeply loved this group of people. Even more than that, he knew that God loved them and cared about them. And even more than that, he knew that the new thing that God wanted to do among the people and the new thing that God would do among the people wouldn't happen until first the people were able to move beyond their soul fatigue and once again have a sense of hope surge through their souls. And so in an effort to try and help those people understand what God could do and what God would do if they would only trust God, Isaiah sat down and in a moment of inspiration, he wrote what today we know of as Deutero-Isaiah, part of which Egza read for us in our first lesson this morning. What did he say? Well, to begin with, Isaiah suggested that it might be helpful to move beyond their soul fatigue if they went back in their minds to the very dawn of creation and reflected upon the greatness and the power of God that was at work in creation. Have you not known, he asked? Have you not heard? He said, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth. And then later he went on in that passage to say, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. In a very real sense, Isaiah was trying to help them to see that God's power and God's greatness are revealed in creation. And if they could get in touch with that, it might help them. I know in my own life, this has sometimes been helpful to me. Every now and then when a sense of discouragement or a sense of soul fatigue begins to creep in on me, in my mind, I will travel back to a few years ago when Carol and I lived in the very heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I'll begin to think of the fall of the year when the leaves are turning color and the whole landscape begins to explode like a vast array of colors on a canvas. And often when I'm doing this, I'll hear God whisper in my ear, if I can do that, don't you think that I can handle any problem that might come your way? Or sometimes In my mind, I'll travel to the beach and I'll stand at the edge of the ocean and I'll imagine myself just as I sometimes do when I go to the beach. I'll just lift my head upward and close my eyes and face right into the sun and feel the warmth of the sun's rays as it beats on my face. I'll imagine hearing that whoosh, 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 as the waves roll up onto the beach. And I'll imagine feeling the coolness of the water as it tickles my toes. And as I'm doing this, it's not uncommon for me to hear God whisper in my ear, if I can do that with creation, don't you think that I can handle any problem that might come your way? You see, what Isaiah understood, what he wanted us in the exiles to understand is that no matter what you're facing, no matter what situation you may be in, God is greater and more powerful than that situation or that circumstance that's confronting you. Well, at the same time that he wanted them to reflect upon the greatness and power of God, I think he also wanted them to reflect upon the nearness of God. You remember, no sooner did he invite them to reflect upon the greatness and power of God than he said to them, he gives power to the faint and strength to the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young shall fall exhausted. But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. In other words, Isaiah is saying, listen, the same one who is greater than us, the same one who is more powerful than us, the same one who stands apart from us is also the one who is very near to us and who is willing to impart to us his power. Now, Jesus wanted us to try and understand this as well. You remember, he said one time to his disciples, in the world you're going to have trouble, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. I'm giving you my power. He tried to help people see this by the way he lived. In our gospel lesson this morning that Jonathan did such a good job reading. By the way, Jonathan, you may be on the move towards becoming a preacher. I want to talk to you after the service. But in the gospel lesson that he read a little bit earlier, Jesus was engaged in ministry. And then we're told that he pulled away for a time to be alone with God, only to re-engage in ministry again. As unique as Jesus is, Jesus knew how important it was to trade in his weariness for God's power. Otherwise, he would suffer from soul fatigue. So do you see what Jesus wants us to get? Do you see what Isaiah wants us to get? They want us to see that through faith and through hope and through spending time with God, we can literally trade in our weariness for God's transcendent power. And when we do that, well, there's just no telling what can happen. The name Peter Ueberroth is almost an iconic name in the world of sports. At one time, he was the commissioner of baseball. At one point, he was, and may still be, I don't know, a part owner in the Pebble Beach Golf Course. He was the chair of the United States Olympic Committee. And in 1984, he was in charge of the Olympics that came to Los Angeles. I've read somewhere that he was asked to describe, out of his experience, some of the most defining moments that he had witnessed in sports. And somewhat ironically, instead of pointing to an athlete or to an athletic event, he went back in his mind to something that happened in 1984 as they were carrying the torch to Los Angeles. According to Ueberroth, the torch went through a small, windswept little village that had only a few people in it. It was more like a ghost town with only a few stores to support the needs of the local farmers and ranchers. And this was the biggest thing that had ever happened in their town. And so the community wanted to choose the most representative person for their community to carry the torch. But they couldn't decide how to do it, and so in the end they just decided to throw all of the names in a hat, and the mayor would draw out a name and that person would carry the torch. And so the mayor reached in the hat, drew out the name of a little girl by the name of Amy, who had been physically challenged from the time of her birth. She could walk, but only barely. She could take a couple of steps, then she'd have to sit down for a while. Then she could get up, take a couple of more steps, and then she would have to sit down for a while. The selection committee didn't know what to do. This wasn't exactly what they had expected, but they all loved Amy, and they couldn't tell her that she couldn't carry the torch. They knew that it would crush her. So word just sort of went through that small community to sort of ignore the event. After all, maybe they had just made too much out of it anyway. Well, the day came for the big event, and the mayor and a few townspeople showed up. Amy, of course, was there with her family. And the moment came when the torch was passed to her. Some national news media had also made their way to the event, and the torch was passed to Amy. She got up out of her wheelchair, and she took a step, and there was a gasp. And then she took another step, and there was another gasp. But then she took another step, and another step, and another step. And it was about 30 seconds before national news media realized what was happening. And Peter Uberoth said that all of a sudden they began to realize, and by the tone of their voice and by the enthusiasm with which they began to relate the story, it kind of caught fire. And the people who in that village who were sitting in their homes watching it began to suddenly realize the heroic history that was being made in their little town. And almost instantaneously they came from their farms and their ranches and from their homes in that little town, and they began to line the last stretch of the course that she was carrying the torch on. And they began to call out with each step, each hesitant step she would take, "Amy, Amy, Amy." And it was almost as if they were infusing power into her, until at last she took her last step, crossed the line, and handed the torch to the next person. Listen, you never know, do you, what can happen if you dare to believe that you can be a vessel of God's transcendent power. Why, you might even mount up with wings like eagles. You might run and not be weary. You might walk and not faint. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning. Our gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day. And we pray that you will help us to dare to believe that we can be vessels of your transcendent power. Help us to trade in our weariness, our soul fatigue, for your power. In the name of Christ we pray, amen. Our closing hymn is hymn number 419, "I Am Thine, O Lord." As we stand and sing this hymn, if there's anyone here this morning who would like to join this church by a profession of faith or transfer of membership, I want to invite you to come. We're singing the first and the last verses only. Will you stand as together we sing?